Chapter 23. Lunch. Rather than arrive early for Blanche Williams's luncheon party, Millicent Moreland drove around Monterey Square several times. Then she moved on 2 blocks north and drove around Madison Square. She went back and forth, circling one square then another, taking her time, driving very slowly. Mrs. Moreland hardly knew Blanche Williams. She had met her briefly at Jim Williams' Christmas parties, and in the 8 months since Williams went to jail, she had made a point of calling Mrs. Williams every few weeks to see how she was getting on. After all, Mrs. Williams was nearly 80 and had moved into Mercer House all alone, without any friends or family nearby. Mrs. Williams appreciated the gesture and told her son she wished she could thank Mrs. Moreland and many of his other friends for being so thoughtful. "Why not have them all to lunch?" he had suggested. The idea terrified Mrs. Williams, but her son reassured her. "You won't have to do anything at all," he said. "I'll take care of everything." From his jail cell, Jim Williams organised every detail of his mother's luncheon party. He drew up the guest list, he ordered stationery for the invitations, and wrote out a sample for his mother to copy. He telephoned Lucille Wright, the cateress, and asked her to prepare a buffet of low country food. He selected the menu: shrimp, smoked ham, roast lamb, okra, squash, sweet potatoes, rice, cornbread, cookies and cakes, and told Mrs. Wright to plan for 20 guests. He later expanded the list to 45, and to serve the meal on the Duchess of Richmond's porcelain, with Queen Alexandra's silverware, both of which she would find in the breakfast cabinet in the dining room. Williams hired his usual bartender and urged his mother, who did not drink, to allow her guests at least half an hour for cocktails before serving lunch. "That will give them the chance to loosen up," he said. "We don't want them to be too glum and serious." Finally, he told Barry Thomas to fill the house with fresh flowers on the morning of the party, and to be sure to go out into the garden before the guests arrive and turn on the fountain. Mrs. Moreland was doing more than simply whiling away the time as she drove around the squares. She was peering into the parks in a way she had never done before, scrutinizing the people sitting on benches, particularly the young men. She was surprised at herself for doing it, but she could not resist. Conflicting emotions were battling inside her today. It had all started with the headline in the morning paper: "New witnesses in Williams' case." 2 new witnesses had come forward, both of them favourable to Jim Williams. Such good news! And on the very day of Such good news! And on the very day of Mrs. Williams's luncheon party. It was the first glimmer of hope for Jim Williams in nearly a year. Before she had even read the story, Mrs. Moreland rushed to the foot of the stairs and called up to her husband to tell him about it. Then she went back to the kitchen and sat down to read. Both of the witnesses were young men, one 18, the other 27. They did not know each other. They had come forward independently to say that Danny Hansford had approached them in the weeks before he died and tried to enlist them in schemes to kill or injure Jim Williams and then steal cash out of his house. Both the young men had said that they had met Danny Hansford while hanging out in Bull Street squares hustling gay men. A flush of embarrassment came over Mrs. Moreland as she read, but she kept reading. One of the young witnesses had been enrolled in a drug rehabilitation program. The other had a string of convictions and was currently being held at the Chatham County Jail on auto theft charges. Both men had said that Hansford wanted them to lure Williams into a sex scene as part of the plot. They had refused. Later, when Hansford himself was killed, one of the young men had thought to himself, "The dumbass tried to pull it off." The newspaper quoted Sonny Seiler saying he would use the affidavits of the 2 young men in his appeal. Mrs. Moreland was in turmoil. Happy as she was for her friend Jim Williams, she was nonetheless appalled. She had been unaware of the details of Williams's private life until his trials had so rudely awakened her, and she had finally come to terms with all of that, mainly by putting it out of her mind. But now, this sordid business about the squares, and these new witnesses, who were they? Male prostitutes? Burglars? Thieves? Mrs. Morland unburdened herself to her husband over breakfast. He attempted to put the new developments in perspective for her. You wouldn't expect this Danny Hansford, this unsavoury little punk, to discuss murderous schemes with someone on the order of Mac Bell, would you? Or Reuben Clark? The names Mr. Morland mentioned were two of Savannah's most esteemed gentlemen, bank presidents both. Well, that did make some sense, Mrs. Morland had to admit. But she was still dazed by what she had learned about the nefarious goings-on in the square, and as she drove around them this sunny noontime in May, she did a little timid sleuthing. Maybe that's one of them, she thought, casting her eyes on a shaggy-haired boy lounging casually on a bench in Madison Square. But then it crossed her mind that he could have been one of those art students from the College of Art in Savannah. How could anybody tell anyone? No. How could anybody tell anymore? Mrs. Morland shuddered and checked her watch. It was time to go to the party, but she had still not resolved her biggest dilemma: what to say to Mrs. Williams about the news. She could hardly exclaim, "Isn't it wonderful?" because a plot involving sodomy, murder and theft could in no way be described as wonderful. There was nothing in those horrid little stories that he was even slightly discussable at a polite luncheon party. She told her husband she thought she might just feign interest in ignorance, dickhead. She told her husband she thought she might just feign ignorance and pretend she had not read the newspaper at all that day. But he pointed out that a tactic like that could backfire. It might just force Mrs. Williams to tell you about it herself, he said. Better to say something non-committal, like, we're keeping our fingers crossed, and yeah. And that is exactly what she did. In fact, in one way or another, that was how all of the guests handled the matter. Mrs. Williams stood at the door of Mercer House in a light blue chiffon dress, accepting obliquely worded congratulations as her guests arrived. I feel the tide is turning, said Mrs. Garrard Haynes, giving Mrs. Williams a kiss on the cheek. Isn't this a sunny day? Said Lib Richardson. Alexander Yearly put it another way. I expect it won't be long until Jim is with us again. Mrs. Williams beamed. It's just like James said. Everything is going to work out just fine. The double doors at the end of the centre hall were open to the courtyard, giving all a view all the way through the house to the opulent greenery of the courtyard garden. The rear of Mercer House was distinctly different from the Italianate facade in the front. The back of the house had the look of an antebellum mansion. Tall columns supported a wide porch, shaded by dense swaths of overgrown wisteria. Several of Mrs. Williams's guests came to sit out in the wicker chairs and look at the sunken garden, the grove of 10-foot-high banana plants, and the lily pond while they ate their lunch. Betty Cole Ashcraft sat beside Lila Mayhew. Mrs. Mayhew poked absently at her tomatoes and okra. I suppose we'll have another Christmas without Jim's lovely party, she said in a wistful voice. Good gracious, Lila, said Mrs. Ashcraft. It's only May. So much can happen before Christmas. And anyway, it does look as though it ain't all over for Jim just yet. Jim always had his party the night before the debutante ball, Mrs. Mayhew went on. That was his night, Friday. I can't remember what on earth we used to do in the days before Jim started having his parties. I've tried, but I can't recall. My memory's fading, you know. Well, never mind, Lila, said Mrs. Ashcraft. "Before you know it, Jim will be right back here giving his parties again. They'll just have to let him out now. I feel sure of it. What with all these ruffians popping up at long last, saying how they was getting ready to kill him. It's a wonder Jim didn't shoot them all. He'd have been well within his rights, you know." Mrs. Mayhew put down her fork. "Every year, Beautant made a new dress for me to wear to Jim's party. Beautant is my colored seamstress. I think sometimes she just redecorated an old dress so it looked new. I wouldn't have known the difference anyhow. But last Christmas, when Jim was in jail, I said, 'Beautant, let's not bother this year. There won't be anything to do in Savannah the night before There won't be anything to do in Savannah the night before the cotillion anyhow.'" "Now, Lila," said Mrs. Ashcraft gently. "And do you know what Beautant told me? She said, 'Miss Lila, there may not be anything for you folks to do that night, but that night, the night before the cotillion, that's the night of our debutante ball.'" "Lord in heaven," said Mrs. Ashcraft, "you don't mean it." "Yes, the colored girls. They have a debutante ball the night before cotillion. When Beautant told me that, I thought how lovely for them. And I knew right then and there I would miss Jim Williams' Christmas party more than ever." Mrs. Mayhew took a sip of her iced tea and gazed into the garden. As the two ladies lapsed into silence, I became aware of a conversation taking place sotto voce between a man and two women seated on the divan across from me. They were speaking like ventriloquists, barely moving their lips so as not to be overheard. When I tuned in to what they were saying, I understood why. "It won't work?" one of the women asked the men. "Why not?" "For several reasons, one of which is those statements sound as if they were bought and paid for by Jim." "Would Jim do that?" "Of course he would," said the man. "So would I in his position. Sonny Seiler had both of the boys checked out by a private detective, Sam Weatherly, an ex-cop, good man. Sam says one of the boys may be telling the truth. The other is poison. He has a reputation for selling testimony to the highest bidder." "Oh, why can't Sonny just use the one who's telling the truth?" "Because no jury is going to believe a street hustler. And anyway, what he has to say is irrelevant. Danny Hansford's motives are not the issue. He may have wanted to kill Jim, but there's no evidence that he actually tried to do it. There's no evidence he even had a gun in his hand that night. No fingerprints, no gunpowder residue. The physical evidence is the issue. Now, if Jim could pay someone to discredit the physical evidence, that would be money well spent." Mrs. Williams came out onto the porch with a Polaroid camera in her hand. "All right now," she said. "Everybody get ready to look pretty." Her guests looked up from the plates, and Mrs. Williams snapped their picture. The camera made a whirring sound and churned out a black rectangle of film. Mrs. Williams went back inside and laid it on the sideboard with the others. "Later on," she said, "I'm going to carry all these pictures over to James. I just know when he sees them, he'll feel like he's been at the party too. I really do. Whenever something important happens, I take a picture to show him. I took one of the wisteria when it blossomed over the front door, and he said, 'Thank you, Mother. Now I can tell it's spring.'" Faces were beginning to emerge in the photographs on the sideboard. There was Emma Kelly sitting between Joe Odom and Mandy in the rear parlour. Upon arriving at the party, Emma had told Mrs. Williams that every day for the past 8 months she had been playing Whispering on the piano. Emma had told Mrs. Williams that every day for the past 8 months she had played Whispering on the piano because she knew it was Jim's favourite song. Joe Odom remarked with an ironic smile that the way things seemed to be going lately, he and Jim might be trading places before too long. Two people whose faces were just now coming into full colour on the sideboard had caused other guests to stare in disbelief when they arrived at the party. Lee and Emma Adler. "Now I've seen everything," Catherine Gore had said when the Adlers appeared in the entrance hall. The antagonism between Lee Adler and Jim Williams had gained a new dimension because of Adler's close association with Spencer Lawton. Lawton had recently announced he was running for re-election, and Adler had co-signed a $10,000 bank loan for his campaign. That check had made Adler responsible for more than 2/3 of all Lawton's campaign money. Adler made no effort to conceal his closeness to Lawton. On the contrary, he put a large re-elect Spencer Lawton poster on the fence in front of his house. Lawton's smiling face could be seen from the windows of Mercer House. If anything, Adler seemed to revel in Williams's predicament. He hosted a Lawton fundraising party in which he stood up and read a telegram from a Lawton supporter who had been unable to attend. It turned out to be a joke telegram signed Jim Williams, Chatham County Jail, and it wished Lawton the very worst of bad luck. Adler's audience was not amused. "It was tacky," said one guest. "It made us all uncomfortable, especially Spencer Lawton, who was present." Meanwhile, Williams waged war against Lawton's re-election campaign from his jail cell, quietly channeling money to Lawton's opponent. A series of full-page anti-Lawton ads appeared in the Savannah newspaper, bearing the headline, "District Attorney Lawton charged with corruption and misconduct." The ad reminded voters that, in reversing the first Williams conviction, the Georgia Supreme Court had accused Lawton of corrupting truth-seeking function of the trial process. The ads had been written and paid for by Jim Williams. For their part, the Adlers were as perplexed as everyone else as to why they had been invited to Mrs. Williams's lunch. After signing their names in the guest book, Emma Adler wrote the word neighbours in parentheses, as if to make the point that their connection to the party was purely geographical. Mrs. Williams slipped the snapshot of the Adlers into the middle of the stack. "James has his reasons, I'm sure," she said in her quiet way. "But oh, that Lee Adler made me so mad one day. I would never tell James this. It's been about 3 months, I guess, but one afternoon he came to make a courtesy call, and I thought, well, the man knows James is in a bind now, and he's coming to have a look around. He thinks there won't be a thing on the walls, and all the furniture will be sold. So he came in, and he was very polite and everything, but I could see right through him. I knew it wasn't in him to be nice to James. He told me, 'Mrs. Williams, I saw Mr. So-and-so from Sotheby's in New York, and this, that, and the other, and if I could do anything for James, well, anything that he wants to sell, just let me know.' Well, I done gone tell you right about the time I was fixing to blow up, but I didn't say a word. I was just as calm as I could be, and I said, 'I appreciate that very much, Mr. Adler, but even where he is now, James has got connections. He can call New York, he can call London, he can call Geneva.' I wasn't ugly to him or anything, but honey, inside I was boiling over, 'cause I knew he came to have a look around." Lee Adler's attachment to Spencer Lawton was the very reason Jim Williams had told his mother to invite him. In Williams's view, Lee Adler controlled Spencer Lawton. "Leopold is the power behind the throne," he said. "He's like the vizier in the Turkish court, the man who stands behind a silken screen and whispers in the Sultan's ear. Lawton doesn't dare make a move without instructions from Leopold. That makes Leopold dangerous, particularly to me. I've given him plenty of reasons to hate me. I engineered throwing him off the board of the Telfair Museum when I was president, and I'm quite sure he pushed the DA into charging me with the first-degree manslaughter instead. Oh, fuck. I engineered throwing him off the board of the Telfair Museum when I was president, and I'm quite sure he pushed the DA into charging me with first-degree murder instead of involuntary manslaughter, though he denies it. He's dangerous, no question, but I understand him. I can talk his language if I have to. Honor among thieves, you know. It's never too late to hold out on Olive Branch. With my new witnesses, my case is going to break wide open. I can feel it. And when that happens, I don't want Leopold skulking around behind that silken screen making mischief. Williams clearly had some irons in the fire. An appeal in process, possible new witnesses, and a candidate working to unseat Spencer Lawton. None seemed particularly promising, but if Williams was to take comfort in them, what was the harm? It was unlikely that an invitation to a congenial luncheon party would convert Lee Adler to his cause. Still, Williams had summoned all the influence he could muster in the effort. The guileless charm of his mother, the delectation of Lucille Wright's cooking, the company of friends in common, and, not least of all, the mysterious powers of Minerva. Minerva had come in from Beaufort and was dressed for the occasion in a maid's costume. For the first hour or so, she stood quietly in the dining room while the guests served themselves from the buffet. Later on, she circulated with a pitcher of iced tea. At one point, she poured 2 tall glasses for the Adlers, while munching on a root and fixing them with a penetrating stare through the purple lenses of her wire-rimmed glasses. Williams kept informed of the party's progress through periodic telephone calls during the course of the lunch. He reminded Barry Thomas to turn on the fountain. Thomas had forgotten, and he gave instructions to his mother and Lucille at each stage of the lunch. When the last of his guests had left, Mrs. Williams and Barry Thomas reported to Williams that the lunch had been a success. Mrs. Williams said she would be leaving shortly to bring the snapshots over to the jail so he could see for himself. After she hung up, she lingered at the desk for a moment. The morning paper lay on the desk in front of her. "Barry?" she said. Barry Thomas turned back at the doorway. "Yes, Mrs. Williams." Mrs. Williams paused, uncertainly. She glanced down at the paper and the story about the new witnesses. I've been wondering," she said. "All these things they've been saying about James and that Hansford boy, and now these other boys." Mrs. Williams gestured at the paper. "I try not to pay any mind, but I don't know. Seems I remember hearing people say the same thing about King James of England. You know, King James had them write the King James Bible. You know, the King James that had them to write the King... Fuck me. You know, the King James that had them write the King James Bible. You know if that's true? You ever heard anybody say that about King James?" "Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I have," said Thomas. "King James did have his favourites among the men at court, if that's what you mean. He had his special friends. I think he had several." The hint of a smile appeared at the corner of Mrs. Williams's mouth. "Well," she said, "all right then.